Welcome everyone to Wednesday class. I'm going to do what I did last time, where Jewish time, we have to give people a few minutes to jump in here. I can see on my screen how many people are watching. So I see that we have to wait a little. So last time we started by singing, and I'll give you a little history of the nigun that we'll start with tonight. And that it's called the forest nigun. It's one of my absolute favorite nigunim that I had the merit to, I guess you call it, compose. I kind of just heard it in my head and it came down. And I was walking in the forest by the moshav, and for decades now, I go walking almost every day in the forest here, many different trails. And one day this nigun just came down, excuse me, and I felt it was the influence, the atmosphere of the beautiful forest. I have to say that the exact place where this nigun came to me was completely burned in the fire a year ago. But the Ben Shemen forest is where we live. There are so many trails. I only went to this same area once, and it was heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. So I have found many other trails, and after around 6 weeks of being confined to 100 meters from home, except for kind of emergency food shopping, we didn't leave the moshav. And so we walked in the moshav. It's just not quite the same thing. And then around 3 or 4 days ago, they lifted the ban for walking in the forest. And so every day since, we've been out there. And it's really the same magic as when this nigun came down, is just the green and the majestic height of the trees and the clouds and the blue sky, enough to inspire anyone. So some of you might know this nigun. I recorded it on my meditative CD, and then I re-recorded it with the words to Kel Mistater. Kel Mistater is a song we sing at Shalashudas. So if you know it, sing along from wherever you are. If you don't know it, it's not hard to learn it. Hi da 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 da. I da 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 da. I da da da. I da 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 da. I da 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 da. I da da da. I da 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 da. I da 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 da. I da da da. I da da da. I da 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 da. Hi na nai 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 na nai 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 nai. Hi na nai 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 nai. Hi nai nai nai. Hi na nai 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 na nai 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 nai. Hi na nai 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 nai. Hi nai nai nai. Hi na nai. Hey nai nai nai. I na nai 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 nai. I na nai nai. I na nai nai. I nai 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 nai. I na nai 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 nai. I na nai 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 nai. I na nai nai. I na nai nai. Dee nai nai dee nai nai by nai nai. One more time. I na nai 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 na nai 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 nai. Hey na nai 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 nai. I nai nai nai. I na nai 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 na nai nai nai. Hey na nai nai nai. Hey nai nai hey. I na nai 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 nai. I na nai 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 nai. I na nai nai. I na nai nai. Dee nai nai dee nai nai by. I na nai 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 nai. I na nai 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 nai. I na nai nai. I na nai nai. Dee nai nai dee nai nai. I nai nai nai. Okay, tonight we're going to be learning about secrets of redemption, past, present, and future. So, as any learning, we have to kind of build a mosaic here. You have to go from step to step and try to get the big picture here. And what I'd like to start with is the simple proposal that when we talk about redemption, it always goes along with exile and redemption. As we'll be seeing in a minute why that is so, but redemption is part of a cycle. And the cycle is exile and redemption. You can't really understand exile without understanding redemption. And you can't understand redemption without necessarily understanding exile. So this energy, this model, this paradigm it goes across the board. That's what we really want to get tonight. The bigger picture is that exile and redemption happens in nature. It happens on the personal level. It happens on the level of all of Israel. There's exile and redemption for all of humanity. And I'm going to say, as it were, there is exile and redemption that even applies to Hashem. So we're going to go through these and try to see these from many different aspects. And we're going to tie in past, present, and future, how these energies of exile and redemption weave themselves through our personal lives, literally on a daily level, and through all of Jewish history and all of world history. So let's start with nature. And in almost everything we're learning, we could expand on these ideas greatly. But I'm looking to create the bigger picture and not get totally bogged down, in a sense, in the details. But I just want to say that for every aspect here, there's many, many, many different things we could add. So on the level of nature, where we see it is in the seasons, where symbolically, and it's not even symbolically, you could actually see it, is winter is like exile, especially in the places that have snow, and most of the trees lose their leaves. And you can feel it in the cold and the snow and the barrenness. And then spring comes with the new buds, the new leaves, greenery, and then the fruit. And that's why the Torah says 3 different times that Pesach has to be in the spring, because in the spring we came out of Egypt. So in other words, coming out of Egypt on a historical level parallels coming out of winter into the spring. So that's on the level of nature. We're going to mention other aspects as we go forward here. On a personal level, we experience this on the daily, weekly, monthly, yearly level, because there are many different ways to explain this. But one way is that exile for an individual is the inability to express oneself. Everyone knows the feeling of being bottled up, of wanting to create something, express something, succeed in something, and it's just not happening. It's just not happening. That is exile, especially the feeling of being blocked and shut down. And what is redemption on a personal level? Is the ability to express ourselves. When we can express ourselves in speech, in action, in accomplishment, in creativity, it just feels so liberating. It's redemptive. On a historical level, so there's Jewish history, which is a literally non-stop process over and over and over again of exile and redemption, of coming to the land and then having to leave it, and coming to the land and having to leave it, of setting up a community in places all over the world, and then there's pogroms and expulsions, and we have to go to a new place. So all of Jewish history is just one repetitive cycle. And in between, there are many redemptions, many miracles, many golden periods, but almost inevitably they lead to further exiles. And the world, as we will see, that it's not just Israel that goes through exile and redemption. That I'm going to leave for a little bit later. As far as how does exile and redemption apply to Hashem? So again, we're talking symbolically. We're talking in the language of human beings so we can understand. But for those who tuned in last week, we talked about this idea that from the Arizal, that for God to be able to create a finite world, there had to be what is called tzimtzum, contraction. Because if there's only infinity and there's only God and there's nothing else, then there is no place for anything else. So God had to contract and open up a space, as it were, for finite reality to be able to exist, to come into being. But in order to do that, in a sense, God has to contract his infinite light, his infinite being. Now, according to Kabbalah, the contraction is only from our side. In other words, how we experience it. From God's side, there was no contraction at all. This is highly paradoxical and is another subject altogether. But here, just to understand that God had a purpose when he created the world. And part of the purpose was to give man free choice. And therefore, if we ask, is the world the way God wanted it? Well, the answer is yes, because God wanted there to be free will and for us to have the chance to mess up and not to get it right, and even to choose not to recognize God at all. But on the other hand, this is not really what God envisioned for the world that he wanted to create. So we see that we have this expression called the exile of the Shekhinah, because the Shekhinah, God's divine presence, is intimately, intrinsically, essentially interwoven with the Jewish people. So that's why even in the pshat, even in the simple understanding, the literal meaning is when Yaakov is going down to Egypt. So God says, I will go down with you and I will come up with you. And this idea is repeated in the prophets many, many times. This idea that if the temple is destroyed, for example, that God is, as it were, lacking a place in this world. Or the statement that says that God is the place of the world, but the world is not his place. This is a highly paradoxical statement. In other words, there is an aspect of exile, even when we're talking about God. Again, this is on very symbolic terms. So we've talked about that this cycle of exile and redemption is happening again in nature, on the personal level, in Jewish history, in world history, which again we're going to get back to, and as it were, even for God. So when we want to understand any concept in Torah, we have to look at the actual words in Hebrew that make up the concepts. And then we have to look at the letters that make up the words. So interestingly enough, the word in Hebrew for exile is golah or galut. And the word for redemption is geula. So you can even hear it. They share the same root. And here we're talking actually about, in Hebrew, words have 3-letter roots. But of those 3 letters, 2 are considered the primary letters, and 1 is somewhat secondary. So that's called the sha'ar, the gate of a word. So the gate of the word for golah and gula is gal, gimel lamed, gal. So this is very appropriate that we're talking about this, because next week is Lag BaOmer. Lag is gal backwards. There's a deep connection actually between gal and lag. Lag BaOmer. Lag BaOmer is the 33rd day of the Omer. So if we look at the word gal, so what does it mean? And then we'll understand why when we talk about exile and redemption as being a cycle, because the word gal means a wheel. A wheel is a gal. a double gal, gal. A wave is a gal. A revelation is something is legalot, something that was first hidden and now it's revealed. So that is the same idea of a cycle, first hidden and then revealed. And the word in Hebrew for reincarnation is gilgul. In other words, what it comes around from one life and then to another life and to another life. So reincarnation is gilgul. So all of these share the idea of a process, of a cycle, where it's all connected. So exile and redemption are completely connected in that way. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe once said, what's the difference between Gola and Geula? He said an aleph, because they're spelled the same, except redemption, Geula, has an aleph to it. And he had many Torahs about how to get from exile to redemption by activating the power of this letter aleph. But aleph also means one. So there's a Torah from Reb Shlomo that he quotes from the Kuzimer Rebbe, who said, on the first day of creation, it says, Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Boker, Yom Echad. There was evening and there was morning, one day. So the Midrash says, what does it mean, Vayhi Erev? One Midrash, there are many Midrashim on every pasuk in the Torah. One Midrash says, Vayhi Erev, these are the deeds of the Rashayim, of evil people. Vayhi Boker, these are the deeds of Tzadikim, of righteous people. So the Kuzimer asks, in time, what's the difference? What's the space? What's the distance between an evil person and a tzaddik? So he says one day, meaning that a person can turn their life upside down, inside out, and change completely in one day. It could be one moment, in one day. So that's the difference, in a sense, between exile and redemption, especially on a personal level, where we can snap out of a depression in a matter of moments. So this is talking about the cycle of exile and redemption, and we see it in the word, in gal, gola, and geula. So on a really broad level, we know that much of the Torah, 4 of the 5 books really are centered on the idea of going down to Egypt and coming out of Egypt. So it's taught over in the Kabbalah that, along with the whole historical reality that we're talking about, there's a level of mashal here, of a parable, and that going down into Egypt, remember, Egypt comes from the word meitzar, the root meitzar, a narrow, confined place. So it's given over that the whole story of going down to Egypt, coming out of Egypt, receiving the Torah, wandering for 40 years, and then ultimately entering into the Holy Land, is a parable for the soul coming down into the body and its journey in the physical world, because the body in relationship to the soul is very confining. The soul is coming from a heavenly abode and coming down into a physical, material world is a very confining experience. And the whole wandering for 40 years in the desert is the whole journey of the soul in the physical material world. And the whole giving of the Torah is teaching us how the soul can live in the body and not only exist and survive, but in a sense, in a deep way, get to a higher level than before it came into the body. So this is another level of understanding exile and redemption on the personal level. So let's now look at Jewish history and world history. And we're aware of the cycle of exile and redemption in the Jewish world, in Jewish history, as we mentioned very quickly. Avram, the first Jew, has to go into exile from where he was born because of the whole incident with Nimrod, who tried to force him to worship idols. So Avram and his family had to leave. They went into exile. And then Avram comes to Israel, in a sense, redemption, the Holy Land. But you'll notice the first thing that happens almost that Avram comes to the land is there's a famine and he has to leave. Yes, he goes down into Egypt and Sarah is taken into Paro's house. Paro's house is afflicted with plagues. He sends Avram and Sarah away with great wealth and they come back to Israel. So we're told that this whole story, this is what's called Ma'aseh Avot Siman Labanim. The deeds of the patriarchs and the matriarchs are a sign for the children. So what happened to Avram and Sarah ultimately happens to all of Israel. Yaakov left Israel because of a famine. He comes to Egypt. Eventually, Paro takes all the Jewish people as slaves. God afflicts them with plagues. We leave with great wealth, and we come back to Israel. So we see this paradigm, this model, repeats itself almost exactly. And then, again, in very, very short, we build the first temple, and that's destroyed, and we go into exile, into Babylonia. And then there's the exile of Persia. And then we come back to Israel, we build a second temple. And then we fight the Greeks, and then we fight the Romans. And then the second temple is destroyed, we go into exile again. And as I said before, then hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of mini exiles and redemptions come, where we're invited into a land, many times with open arms, because Jews have many positive things they can contribute to a society. But almost every time, after 50 years, 100 years, sometimes 500 years, everything changes. And then, as we know, especially the last 1,000 years, just a long string of expulsions, inquisitions, pogroms, and then ultimately the Holocaust. But if we go back, we'll see that the seeds of exile and redemption are back to Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve. Because the first exile is after we ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, we had to go into exile. They were expelled from the garden. And then Cain kills Abel. And his punishment is he has to be a wanderer. He can't stay in one place. He's in constant exile. And then comes the flood. And in a sense, Noah has to go into exile in a boat in a very confined place for over a year. And then comes out, and there's a possibility of a new world, a redemptive possibility. Doesn't turn out so good. And then we have the Tower of Babel. And then they're dispersed all over the world. That was their punishment, another exile. So we see that it's not only Jewish history, it's all of world history. So since we are attributing, in a sense, that the seed of exile is in the Garden of Eden, and it's eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So what I'm about to give over now, I'm going to do it in short because we have very limited time here, is the teachings from the Arizal. The Arizal said that the exile in Egypt that we went through, he called it the exile of Dat. Dat meaning knowledge, the same word of Eitz Dat Tov Ra, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so he traces this energy back to the Garden of Eden and eating from the tree. And he explains that if we look at the exile in Egypt, so we'll see throughout the story, the word knowledge, dat, appears over and over and over again. I'll try to run through it very, very quickly, but this is how we get to deeper understandings of what the Torah is telling us. If you have a word or a concept or a number that repeats itself over and over again, and there's a string of them, then we have to connect the dots in order to understand what is happening here. So if you remember, after Yosef basically saves Egypt, saves the world from famine, but after Yosef dies, so it says that a Yakam Melech Chadash Asher Lo Yada et Yosef. A new king came who did not know Yosef. And then when Israel cries out from the bondage, so the Torah says that God heard their crying and he knew. He knew. So then he reveals himself to Moshe. Moshe comes to Paro, says, let my people go. And Paro says, this is all in the text. These are not midrashim. This is all in the Chumash, in the literal text. So Paro says, I don't know your God, and I'm not going to let the people go. And then I invite everyone to look at this. If you go through the 10 plagues, each time God gives a message to Moshe to tell to Paro. And most of the plagues, there's an explanation that has the word to know in it. Sometimes we'll say, in order that Egypt will know that I'm God, or they will know that there is no other God, or there is one God in the land. And I believe it's 5 or 6 times out of the 10 plagues where the explanation is also given that the purpose was for Egypt to come to know God and for Israel to come to know God, because God comes to Moshe and says, I appeared to Avram, Yitzhak, and Yaakov in the name Kel Shakai. and my name, Yud-Ke Vav-Ke, I did not make known to them. So when we follow all of this, we can understand why Ari, the Arizal, said that the exile in Egypt was the exile of Dat and the fixing of Dat. And that's why this is the period we're in right now, it's Sferat Omer, between Pesach and Shavuos, that the purpose of coming out of Egypt was to receive the Torah and to come into Eretz Yisrael. So also, in our tradition, the generation that comes out of Egypt is called Dor Deah, the generation of knowledge. Now, they certainly did not fix totally the sin of eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and all that entails. That's a whole class in itself. What is it? What were the ramifications? But the Ari is explaining that knowledge, went into exile, and it will remain in quasi-exile until Mashiach comes. And only then will we be able to fix the ramifications of eating of the tree. And the Rambam, the last chapter of Mishnah Torah, his classic work that is so influential until this day, the last two chapters of this book that goes to all of Jewish law is in the laws of kings. And in it, he describes the Mashiach and the Messianic era. And the very last words, he quotes Isaiah and says that when Mashiach comes, the knowledge of God will fill the earth like the waters cover the sea. In other words, that will be the tikkun. And that's why in Kabbalah and Chassidut, constantly talking about tikkun adat, or very much what Rabbi Nachman of Breslov calls tikkun habrit. In fact, we're just finishing here in Eretz Yisrael, anyways, on the day of Yesod Sheba Netzach. Yesod is always connected to Brit, and Brit is always connected to Dat. Okay, so now I want to add one other thing here. In the Shema, so in the Shema is the 6 words. We learned this last class, 6 words, 25 letters. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. So you can look in any prayer book where you'll see that in the Torah itself, that the ayin of the word Shema here is written big, and the Dalet of Echad is 1, is also big. So when you spell it ayin Dalet, it spells witness, aid. Aid means a witness. So it's telling us that the mission of the Jewish people is to be a witness to the whole world of the oneness of God. There's one God. But if you take those same 2 letters, the Daled and the Ayin, and you read them backwards, it's Da, no. So this is a very, very deep understanding, teaching from Rav Yitzhak Ginsburg. He says if you take the name Adam, and each letter becomes a word itself, so the Aleph of Adam is Emunah, faith. The Daled of Adam is Dat, knowledge. And the Mem of Adam is Ma'aseh, is a deed, action. So the teaching is that this, in a nutshell, tells us what we're doing in this world and how to achieve a Torah consciousness, is that we take faith, and the Shema is the cardinal statement of faith, and That faith, though, is not blind faith. It's faith grounded and rooted in dat, in knowledge. It's a type of faith that is born from everything that we know, everything we come to know. And then we have to take that faith and knowledge and put it into action, and to internalize it, integrate it, and to act upon it in the world. So this idea, and it's symbolic of the word Adam, because the whole exile in the Garden of Eden begins with Adam, So it's all about what's called fixing dat. So the Arizal added another layer here, a very, very important layer. And it's a total paradigm shift completely, because even in our prayers, especially in Musaf of Shabbat and holidays, we always say that we can't come to the temple, and we can't even come near to the temple. Now, most of Jewish history, virtually every Jew in the world was not in Israel. Times have changed greatly, but for most of Jewish history, at least the last 2,000 years, we were very far away from Israel and having a temple. But in Musaf, we say that the temple was destroyed for our sins. In other words, there was a measure for measure here. And all of the prophets said the same thing. They came and they warned the people over and over and over again, is if you change your ways, and they pointed out what we were doing wrong, if we change our ways, the temple does not have to be destroyed. But if not, the temple will be destroyed and you will be sent into exile. And one prophet after the other, starting with Moshe in the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, made it very clear what our history would be. Anyone who reads the book of Deuteronomy, all of Jewish history is laid out right in front of us. But the Ari came and he reformulated, or in psychological terms, he reframed all of Jewish history. And he did it in the following way. We already mentioned this idea of tzimtzum, that God contracted his infinite being to make a place for the world. And then we're taught in Kabbalah from the Ari that God shone into the middle of this empty space a ray of light called a kav, ray of light. And from that ray of light, everything that would ever be created was created, came into being. And we explain that as being, that's like the Big Bang. And then we're told that as creation is coming into being, the light, the infinite light of God pouring into finite vessels, broke the vessels. The vessels, because of their own immaturity, were not able to hold this awesome light, and they shattered. This is what's called shvirat hakelim, the breaking of the vessels. These are concepts many of you have heard of and are familiar with. But the Ari took that and he explained, so what happened with the breaking of the vessels? That this light, this primordial divine light, was in the shattered vessels. And this was in what's called the previous world, called the world of Tohu. And that this world is called the world of Tikkun, the world of rectification. So this world is made up of the broken vessels of the previous world. So the Ari explains, is a very, very deep thing. And Rav Kook, the first chief rabbi, then it was Palestine, picked up on this tremendously, and he understood it and lived it, is that the Ari explains that the breaking of the temple, it's not like it wasn't because of our misdeeds, but he said it's playing out a much bigger cycle of exile and redemption, and that for the final redemption to occur, the Jewish people had to be scattered all over the world, just like the broken vessels. But in the broken vessels, we were bringing light. And so we brought light to the whole world. And as this is the next and the concluding part of this class is what's happening now and what will happen in the future, is that now that we are coming back to Israel, so all of the light that was shown out into the world is now being brought home, also with the best that the world has to offer that can fit into Torah. And it's all coming back into Israel. And this is where redemption will come from. So we can almost see it physically. We're in Israel, and then we're scattered, and then we come back. And many of Rav Kook's teachings talk about this in maybe different language, but is dealing with the same concept, So that brings us to where we are now. Where are we on the scale, or not the scale, but where are we in the linear continuum of exile and redemption? So the truth is, exile and redemption is always happening simultaneously. In every exile, there is the seed of redemption. And in every redemption, there is a seed of exile. And so right now, there's no doubt whatsoever that we are in a redemptive process. 150 years ago, I don't know the exact numbers, but around 150 years ago, I'm not even sure there were 1,000 Jews in Israel. Most of them lived in the four holy cities. Maybe there was 2,000, maybe there was less, I'm not sure. You'll pardon me not knowing the exact number. There was virtually a handful, and they were almost all in only four places: Sfat, Tiberia, Yerushalayim, and Hebron. In the last 150 years, everyone, I don't have to go over it, we went from that reality, and it was, life here was impossibly difficult. In fact, almost all the people lived off of contributions from outside of Israel. And in 150 years, 72 years of the state of Israel, we are now a thriving, truthfully a world power in many, many aspects. I think we're seeing it already with the coronavirus, that Israel is now putting out a certain type of mask that's considered like the best type of mask. And apparently they just found antibodies that it's not a vaccine, but if someone has coronavirus, except for cases where there's complications that set in immediately, but apparently is able to work. And everyone knows the advances in water and solar energy, in medical research, in technology. It's just astounding, absolutely astounding. And we have our own country. We can, Bezrat Hashem, defend ourselves with God's help, of course. And the ingathering of the exiles, in short, everyone knows this. All of the prophecies of the prophets are coming true before our eyes. We are living them, especially those people living in Israel. We are living the prophecies. Every Jew in the world is part of this prophetic, redemptive process that is happening. And one way to understand, like, why now? What happened that didn't happen 400 years ago or 600 years or 800 years ago? So it's inescapable to make a connection, even though it's beyond our comprehension. It's beyond our comprehension. And as the Lubavitcher Rebbe said many places, it's not our place whatsoever to, in a sense, offer reasons or why the Holocaust happened. But we can't escape that 3 years after the Holocaust, the state of Israel was reborn. It's just a reality. How that worked, and even deeper, why that had to work that way, these are mysteries that when Mashiach comes, he'll explain. But along with that is the fact that we're nearing the year 6000. And already in the Talmud, they call it a prediction or a prophecy that this cycle of history would last for 6,000 years, and the 7,000th year would be the time of Mashiach. Right now, we're in the Jewish year 5780. We are approaching the 6,000th year. So it is no coincidence. It's nothing that's just kind of happening in a vacuum, that Jews started returning to Israel in mass approximately 150 years ago. Famous that the Vitebsker Rebbe came with hundreds and hundreds of Hasidim in the 1770s. So that's already 250 years ago. But the increase and the momentum has been a floodgates opened up, and within, there's a debate, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, a majority of Jews will live in Israel for the first time since the first temple in 2,500 years. Right now, we're almost there that a majority of Jews are living in Israel. And we're told when that happens, it's kind of like scales, that the spiritual nature of the world will change. So if we look even before all the prophets said this, and even before Moshe Rabbeinu in the book of Devarim predicted all of Jewish history, it really goes back to Avram Avinu. Avram Avinu had one mission in the world, and that was to reveal and spread and teach about one God, and all that entails, the unity of everything, really goes back to Avram Avinu. And our mission really hasn't changed. And everyone attributes the first, what we'll call universal vision for mankind, to our prophets. Isaiah, Hosea, Micha, Zechariah, Yechezkel, Yirmiyahu, all of them had prophecies about that in the end of days, just like the Rambam said, we quoted before from Isaiah, that the knowledge of God will cover the earth like the waters cover the sea. And we call it now the global village. But that's what Avram had in mind, because he wasn't teaching Jews. There were no Jews. He was spreading the knowledge of God, the reality of divinity, of what we're doing in this world, spirituality, what is the mission of humanity, and how to reach it. And this is the same mission we have today. And there's no doubt that one of the many, many, many experiences that have come out of the coronavirus is the reality of a global village. That we see that this virus started in one place, and because of air travel, it basically spread all over the world. And I mean, this is right out of a Hollywood movie, this idea that there's some alien or some foreign alien force that comes down but unifies humanity in the face of the threat. So with all of the negativity that has come out of this, and especially the people who have been sick, should all have a refuah shlema, and people have passed away. We're talking about, I don't know what the number is, but it's getting towards 1 million people around the world. But what has come out of this is what everyone knew, but really brought it home, the aspect of a global village. And this is messianic here. This idea that ultimately humanity will learn to work together, to come together. There'll be a world of peace and harmony. And I want to end with just a couple of important ideas. One is from Rabbi Ginsburg, and he teaches how will Mashiach reveal himself? What will happen? And he says like this, from the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov taught that we all have a spark of Mashiach within us. And he said, when enough people activate and come to realize their own spark of Mashiach, and there'll be what he called a critical mass of spiritual energy created by individuals realizing their potential. When we say messianic spark, when people reach their spiritual potential, their divine soul is revealed to them and can be manifest in the world, a critical mass will occur, which will bring the Mashiach. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, in his last years, so he was very, very much into promoting the idea of learning about Mashiach, envisioning Mashiach. And he used to say like this, he said, open your eyes, Mashiach is here. So what did he mean by that? Open your eyes, Mashiach is here. Because in Hebrew, the word for future, atid, also means prepared, to be prepared. The word occurs in Megillat Esther. And the Jews had to be prepared to defend themselves against Haman and his cohorts. Atidim. So the future is prepared already in the present. Just like Rabbi Nachman would teach, what is the world to come? A world that is always coming in the present. It's already here. That's what it says about Avram Avinu. Avram Zaken uba biyamim Hashem beirach et Avram bakol. Avram became old in wisdom, and he came into days, and God blessed him with everything. So it's explained in Kabbalah and Chassidut. What does it mean, came into days? He had 1 foot in the world to come and 1 foot in this world. In other words, past, present, and future were like all simultaneously, just because he had divine consciousness. For God, hu haya, v'hu hoveh, v'hu yiyeh b'tifara. He was, he is, and he will be. But that's not linear. For God, it's all happening at the same time. So divine consciousness gives us a portal to that kind of understanding. And one last thing is, so Reb Shlomo, he used to use this expression all the time when he would try to explain to us like how high a concert was or a teaching was. So he would say it was like after Mashiach came. But they experienced it in the present. And so the idea of all three of these, what Rav Ginsburg said, Reb Shlomo, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe, are all saying the same thing in different ways, is that we need to draw the future into the present. We have to envision a messianic world, a world of peace and harmony, and we have to like draw that into now. And the way to do it, the most potent way is through joy. That joy will pull, because the word Mashiach, if you permute the letters, is Yismach. He will be joyous, meaning he will bring joy to the world, the joy of knowledge, the joy of being close to God. So with this, we're going to end the class. Many of you will be watching this not live. So I just want to tell everyone that next week is Lag BaOmer, and we have 3 classes, all devoted to understanding Lag BaOmer, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Rabbi Akiva, and everything that goes along with it. So on Sunday, the subject is Crash Course in Kabbalah in preparation for Lag BaOmer. On Lag BaOmer, originally we said to be announced, so it is now at 8:30 Monday night, Israel time, and that will be spiritual mystical insights into Lag BaOmer. And Wednesday will be the day after Lag BaOmer, portraits of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and Rabbi Akiva. So hopefully we'll see all of you, hear from all of you, and thank you for joining us. And please tell your friends, share with them the Facebooks and the emails, and thank you again.